Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Community Archives discussion. This week, we will be talking about community archives and sustainability. So here are our weekly topics. What are the sustainability issues that community archives face? How can funders and traditional archives help support community archives? What steps can community archives take in order to promote their sustainability? And what issues must community archivists take into consideration when making sustainability choices? So we'll start by talking about some of the sustainability concerns that community archives are faced with. So this is from the Baker article for this week on page 480, where the author talks about community archives facing sustainability concerns related to being sustainable beyond the participation of the founders or the original people that come together and develop the community archive. Oftentimes when people get involved in a project like this, they may feel very energetic and they may feel a strong commitment to the project and a strong desire to achieve some of the goals that we've discussed community archives being formed to achieve. So reclaiming power, providing alternative perspectives about a community, helping community members develop a sense of identity and a sense of representational belonging, fighting against symbolic annihilation. And all these goals are great, but as time passes and as people perhaps begin to lose interest or lose some of the zeal that they possessed when they started a community archive, that can result in the operations of the community archive kind of dropping off. And this is especially true if there aren't people brought into the community archive that are engaged, that are energetic, and are invested in making sure that the community archive succeeds. And it might not be that people lose interest. It may be that they're still interested, but they simply aren't able to devote as much time to the community archive as they once were. Perhaps they get a new job that's more demanding. Perhaps they have a person to take care of that they didn't have to take care of before. It could be that a person moves away or really moves away and dies. There are a whole variety of issues that could result in the founders and creators of a community archive not being able to connect with the project as much as they did previously. And so it's important for community archives to have that second wave of support and engagement and participation to keep the community archive going. Community archives may also face sustainability issues that are more long-term, and they may only have the funds, or they may only receive public funding to address short-term concerns. So, they may receive money to buy, folders or preservation equipment to help preserve community records, which is important and great in the short term. But if you don't have the funding, the sustainable funding for people that actually know how to use those materials, or have other kinds of expertise that will benefit the archives in the long run, then those funds maybe aren't as useful or aren't as valuable as funds that might be invested in more longer term requirements or demands that a community archive can place and require. So, you might have money to buy a server space, but if you don't have the money to pay a staff member who has sort of the expertise or knowledge to help your archives develop some kind of appraisal policy or digital preservation policy, then that ultimately that server space might go to waste or quickly be overwhelmed by materials of questionable value. And since community archives may be resource challenged, they may just be in survival mode and not really thinking about some of the bigger picture issues and some of the things that may be beyond the immediate needs that they have. But it's important that the community archives are able to think about and meet the long-term needs that community archives face. And then finally, the Baker article mentions sustainability as an autonomous archives. So sustainability is an archives that is capable and has the power to make record-keeping decisions surrounding the records that the community produces and places in the archive. The sustainability as an autonomous archive can be undermined if archives enter into unequal partnerships, which is something that we talked about earlier on in this course. That can result in the archives perhaps still existing, but the records themselves may be beyond community control in many ways. And obviously, this type of arrangement can go against some of the goals of claiming power and self-representation that community archives are created to enact. So having an archives that may exist but doesn't have a lot of autonomy and isn't an archive that is responsive to the wishes of its community, but rather the wishes of a more mainstream archives or perhaps an exterior funding organization, that can certainly be a problematic reality for community members. So this ties into my next slide here, where sometimes sustainability may come at the cost of independence. And again, thinking back to some of those partnerships that we discussed earlier on in this course. An archives that has a relationship with a mainstream archives and gets advice or supplies or is able to have their records held by a more traditional archive may be more sustainable into the future because they're able to have access to resources that they may not have access to otherwise. But this may come at the cost of the independence of the community archive, and it may undermine the ability of the community archives to be responsive to its community, to make record-keeping decisions that keep the well-being of the community at the forefront. It may undermine the ability of a community archives to respond to the concerns and needs of community members. And again, this has obvious conflicts with the reason and purpose of community archives. But sometimes it's a compromise that community archives have to face, and you could argue that it might be better if the records survive in some form, but it certainly would be a shame for a community archive to engage in some kind of partnership with a mainstream archives or a community or a funding agency that results in the same kind of marginalization and disenfranchisement that community archives were created to fight against. So to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the sustainability issues that community archives face, there are quite a few of them, and a lot of these are present in more traditional archives as well. So it's not just community archives that necessarily face these issues, but since community archives may have less support and less stable support, you could make the argument that these issues are more prevalent among community archives and more impactful among community archives. So a lack of staff, just having people to help direct the archive, to help facilitate community participation, to reach out to community members, to have expertise about how archival concepts can be employed in a way that doesn't take power away from the community. This might be a resource that community archives struggle to overcome. So you need to have skilled staff as well, right? You need to have people with expertise in the areas of digital preservation, appraisal, outreach, a whole host of the different topics and processes that archives engage in. A lack of space is another sustainability issue that community archives face, especially if the community archive wants to have a physical location somewhere. Obviously, that involves having to pay for utilities, having to pay probably some kind of property tax, having to pay for the maintenance of a building. So that can certainly be an issue. A lot of community archives overcome this by existing online. But as we talked about before, not having a physical space that community members can call their own has its own sort of negative implications for a community and for our community archive. So, that's one solution, but it may not be the best solution necessarily. Community archives may not possess collections that are widely known or are widely valued by the public. They may be records that are truly understood and appreciated only by other community members, and that can impact the ability of community archives to point at their collections and say, hey, these things are worthy of being supported. They are important collections, and we would like to see them taken care of. People on the outside might be like, oh, well, we don't really know what this is, or we don't really understand why it's important. So that's going to make us less willing to invest time and resources into supporting the care of this collection or these particular collections. Another big issue that community archives face are technology issues. So I talked about digital preservation, web archiving. If you are a community archive that is going to exist, solely online, that may solve your problems of not having to pay rent for a space for the archive, but you have to know how to put digital records online. You have to know how to preserve those records over time, and those things usually aren't free. There are a lot of tools out there that can facilitate archives doing those things fairly economically, but it still takes server space. It still takes a certain level of technical prowess and expertise to carry out these technological processes, and community archives may not have those technical skills available to them. A sustainability issue that might be particularly pertinent for community archives is the need for community archives to balance competing interests within the community. So if you're relying on members of your community for support, which is a great way to stay at least reasonably autonomous as an archive, then you have to be aware of the different divisions that may exist within your community, and find some way to navigate through those divisions in a way that isn't going to upset a particular part of your community that you may rely on for support and for resources. The last thing that you want to do is have a community archive that sort of supports only one part of your community or one perspective within your community, and have that result in parts of your community that don't agree with the perspective that your community archive has, saying, okay, well, we don't really feel like this community archive represents us, so we're not going to give you our support. So it's good to have as many perspectives represented within your community archives as possible, not only because that provides a more community-centric and more nuanced view of your community, but also because it can help you and help your community archive be more broadly supported by your community and more capable of receiving the resources that it needs to thrive into the future. We talked about how one of the sustainability concerns that archives face is sustainability beyond the founders of a community archive. So succession planning is a sustainability issue that community archives face. And again, this might be particular to community archives and less of an issue for mainstream archives. If the director of a mainstream archives moves away or ceases to be involved with the archives, that archives may have the resources available to hire another director or another leader. If the founder of a community archives moves on, it may be more difficult to replace that enthusiasm and expertise. So as the Jules article notes on page 9 and the Baker article on page 479, succession planning is an important consideration for community archives, especially to make sure that there is someone waiting in the wings that is able and willing to take up the community archive and continue to be involved with its operations for the foreseeable future. The Jules article also mentions an inability of community archives to pursue fundraising opportunities. When you think of archives receiving support, people might be like, oh, we'll just write a grant. Well, writing a grant can be an incredibly long and complicated process, and not every community is going to have someone within the community that has the expertise and the skill and the time to do that. That may be less of a case for more traditional archives who might be attached to an institution that has individuals within that institution that are more knowledgeable of that process and are more capable of navigating through grant writing and grant submission and all the other stuff that goes on with pursuing different fundraising opportunities. So this really highlights the importance of community members being aware of the impact that a community archive is having on the community. and really highlights the need for community archives to make it as clear as possible to community members what those impacts are and why these impacts are positive for the community. So making sure that outreach takes place is a big sustainability issue that community archives face. Again, just because community members are more likely to be in the best position to understand the value that a community archive has, and that's helpful, but you still need to make the case to them about why the community archive exists and why the community archive should be supported. And again, this is especially true if grants are difficult to obtain and the community archive doesn't have as much access to outside resources as the Jules article again mentions on page 8. So moving on, let's talk a little bit about how can funders and traditional archives help community archives. On pages 9 and 10, the Jules article advocates for equitable relationships that support the activities of community archives. Again, developing these partnerships between traditional archives or funding agencies and community archives that are equal, that do have true power sharing tied into them, and making sure that these partnerships don't result in a loss of autonomy or power or control by community members. So simply by approaching community archives with equality and power sharing and the well-being of the community in mind, funders and traditional archives can really help community archives meet some of the sustainability concerns and issues that they might be facing. The Jules article also talks about inclusive fundraising activities. Having fundraising activities that include community members and support community members. The Jules article also mentions requiring equitable partnerships and funded collaborative projects. So if community archives are contributing to mainstream archives in some way, then the community archives should be compensated for that effort in some form or another, and not just be kind of taken for granted and seen as an organization that is not worthy of continued support. So I think the bottom line here is just respect, having a genuine respect for a community archive, a genuine respect for the mission that a community archive is attempting to carry out, and developing partnerships and other relationships with community archives in a way that is respectful and does truly result in power sharing and equitable relationships. That's sort of the main underlying way that funders and traditional archives can help support community archives. Related to that, I would also add understanding the community and understanding what the community's needs are. And this is related to having equitable partnerships, but understanding what a community is, what a community has gone through, what a community needs, and taking that into consideration when you are providing advice or resources to them, and not forcing community archives to behave in a way that that doesn't meet the needs of their community simply because they need resources to survive. So again, just going back to these basic ideas of respect and equality. So let's talk a little bit about some of the steps that community archives can take in order to promote their sustainability. We talked about planning for succession, so that's something that the Baker article also mentions on page 485. The Baker article also suggests developing donation policies and having a donation policy in mind so that donations don't outpace the availability of the archives to store and provide resources to maintaining records over time. And that's something the Cioccolio article mentions on page 158. The Jules article talks about developing earned income strategies and thinking about things such as publishing and retail sales or memberships. That could be another way to gain access to resources. And there's actually an example in the Jules article of an archive that did that fairly well. The Barnes chapter for this week talks about crowdfunding and marketing. So that could certainly be a way that community archives can exist, is to have some crowdfunding efforts, something like Kickstarter or a GoFundMe, which are pretty common these days. You know, I think that there are some positives and negatives of those types of things. You know, of relying on crowdfunding. It certainly might not necessarily be the most reliable source of income. It's not something that you can count on, you know, receiving X number of dollars through Kickstarter or X number of dollars through GoFundMe every year. So it might be something that is only really suitable for sort of short-term needs. It might, in some people's eyes, undermine the credibility or professionalism of your repository if you are asking for money on something like Kickstarter or GoFundMe. So that could be a negative. Community members may not feel comfortable with people outside of the community donating to a community archive through crowdsourcing or crowdfunding. So that might be another potential negative. But you know, at the end of the day, money is money, and crowdfunding is certainly something that the community archives may want to or may even have to consider. Another thing that the Baker article mentions is a plan for the possible closure of the community archive. So if the archive closes, what happens to the records, and having some kind of plan in place to make sure that that they're taken care of, even if the unfortunate happens. So even if the community may not have complete control over the records anymore, at least they'll exist in some form, in some way, that the community and other members of the public can access the records. One big way that community archives can promote their sustainability is through community participation. This is something that the Colloquio article talks about. So having different events with community members in which archival processes are actually carried out. So the Colloquio article mentions events to sort items for digitization and photo tagging. And this can be a really great way to get the help that a community archives needs. And, you know, it's usually pretty cheap or free labor. And this can overcome some of the staffing issues that community archives face, as we discussed earlier. It can also be a great way to increase awareness of the community, increase the connection that people have with the records in a community archive. You know, they may not really have an idea of what kind of records a community archive contains until they go in and they're actually looking at them and working with them. And, you know, that may result in the records in the community archive resonating with community members in a way that's that didn't exist before community members participated in these kinds of activities. I would say it's important for these events to be engaging and interesting. In the Coquilio article, it seemed like some of them were kind of tedious and not something that a person would really want to do at all or very often. And that's not really the impression of archives and community archives that you want your community members to have. So if you are going to do these kinds of events, just make sure that it's something that's fun and interesting and isn't something that is going to make someone wish that they were, having their teeth drilled rather than sitting here and sorting and tagging photos for an hour. Another great thing about participation is that it can help a community archive take advantage of community members that may have technical skills. And we talked before about how technical issues are big hurdles for community archives. But if you have community members that are experts in digital preservation or arrangement description and so on, then having events where they can participate in the community archive can be really beneficial. So again, this is something that the Coquilio article talks about. So the author actually developed several digital tools to aid in the community archives archiving efforts. And that is certainly a great resource for a community, assuming that there are members of the community that have these kinds of skills. So, finding out what kind of skills might be present in your community and encouraging people with those skills to help out your archive and participate in your archive in some way, ideally at little or no cost, can be a really powerful tool for sustainability. As I mentioned before, and the Jules article again mentions on page 11 and 12, being proactive and demonstrating the value of the community archives and the impact of community archives within the community. That's certainly a big step that community archives can face. On page 126, the Barnes article talks about the need to develop a compelling story to engage the community. So you got to have something that kind of sinks into the community and inspires people to come out and actually engage in things like arranging and describing records or developing digital tools, right? If they're not interested, if they don't see some kind of value in the archive, if they don't see a positive impact that the archive is having on their community, then it may be less likely that they are going to want to take the time to do that kind of thing. So you have to show people why what you're doing is important and make them want to contribute. A big thing overall, or a couple of big things overall, are to think long term and evaluate your goals as a community archive and make decisions that are going to support those goals. So again, community archives may spend a lot of time in survival mode and just trying to meet their immediate needs, but if they don't have this long-term perspective about, what are our goals, what do we want to look like in 10 years, who's going to run this thing in 10 years, and so on, thinking about that can really improve the odds that a community archive is going to be sustainable and is going to exist into the future. If people working in a community archive are not thinking about those things and they are just kind of reacting to the short term, then that can really put their long-term survival and sustainability into question. A big thing is that the steps that a community archive takes in order to promote their sustainability have to be acceptable to community members and have to meet the needs of community members. You know, this is a pretty essential thing. Again, you don't want to have a situation where community records are being held hostage by a community archive or a traditional archive that isn't really responding to the community and isn't meeting the community's needs. Because again, this really undermines the whole reason for why a community archive exists in the first place. I would say another important step that community archives can take is just to accept that sometimes good enough is acceptable. And you know, you don't have to have a sleek modern archive. If you have a place where you can keep the lights on or the servers going and people can come and interact with records and coalesce as a community and share their experiences and learn about the experiences of others, then you know that might be good enough. And you don't really need to worry about or strive for much more than that. So sometimes you just have to accept what you can do and do the best you can, and just kind of go from there. So again, a little diagram here. So again, an important thing here is demonstrating value. If you don't demonstrate value, you aren't going to get people participating in your community archive. You're not going to be able to take advantage of the time and skills of your community members, and that can really set a community archive back if they don't have that resource to draw on. And we talked about participation as being a key part of community archives. So if that participation doesn't take place, then do you really have a community archive, or do you just have one or two people making decisions on behalf of the rest of their community? So ideally, things like crowdsourcing and community participation increase engagement, increase the willingness of people to want to support the archive, increase the willingness of people to provide resources to the archive, and that can increase sustainability in the long run. But again, the key part here is demonstrating value. How can you demonstrate value? You know, there are a lot of ways that archives can do outreach. You know, like I said, some of these crowdsourcing events can be a way that archives can demonstrate value. You know, things like social media. You know, they're speaking with community leaders and making sure that the message about what your community archive is doing sort of trickles down to other people within the community. You know, there are a whole host of ways that archives can talk about what they're doing and why they're doing it and why it's important. Things like exhibits, you know, having a website, having some kind of instructional sessions with community members about the records or about how to use the records. You know, there are a whole host of opportunities for archives of really all stripes to demonstrate their value to the archives, increase participation with the archive, increase engagement with the archive, and it will ultimately be more sustainable into the future. So next we'll talk about some of the issues that community archives must face when making sustainability choices. So again, one is the risks of partnerships with other organizations, which we've talked about. The needs of community members, which we also touched on. You know, you have to keep the well-being of your community at the forefront when you are making sustainability decisions. An interesting one is the need for expertise. And so this is something that the Barnes article talks about on page 125. Especially when it comes to something like crowdfunding. So, you know, the Barnes article asks, is it really sensible to spend $500 to set up a $1,000 Kickstarter campaign? So just having people with that kind of perspective attached to your archive and participating in your archive's decisions in some way is a really good thing to have. So again, a lack of expertise might be something that community archives face and something that they have to take into consideration when making sustainability choices. You know, if you are planning on writing a grant, thinking about, okay, do we really have the expertise to write this grant? Is it something that we really have a realistic shot of getting? Is it something that we should spend a lot of effort or really really count on getting in the future? Or might that be outside of our realm of possibility? So just thinking about not only the needs of your community members, but also the capabilities of your archives. And, you know, is your archives capable of taking advantage of particular sustainability efforts, or should they maybe think about different ways to obtain the resources that it needs? So we'll wrap things up by talking a little bit more about some of the issues that community archives must take into consideration when making sustainability choices. An interesting one is this balance between professionalism and sustainability, and how, in some ways, if a community archives attempts to become more professional, quote unquote, that may undermine its ability to be sustainable in the long run. You might think on first blush that if a community archives is more professional, then okay, well, that's going to make them more likely to be appealing to donors and more capable of receiving the funding and resources that the community archive needs to succeed. But that's not necessarily the case. One thing that might throw this preconception into question is if the professionalization of community archives starts to alienate community members. If this professionalism results in the community archives making decisions that the community members don't like, especially influential community members, then that can result in a lack of interest and a lack of support from the community itself. And that can certainly have long-term repercussions for the survival of a community archive. If you lose the support of the community or the support of key members of your community, then that can really impact the types of crowdsourcing and other types of engagement that community archives can engage in. Professionalization takes resources. It may take resources beyond what an archives can bring to bear. So a community archives may expend resources in an attempt to quote unquote professionalize that that really could be used in other areas that are more likely to result in the archives being able to support itself in the long run. So instead of spending time and money to write a grant that you may or may not get, why not spend that time and money to reach out to your community and establish this this bedrock and foundation of community support that may be more reliable and more achievable for your community archive. This balance can also be thrown into question if the community archive becomes professional enough to gather interest and resources, but that leads it away from its ability to be community centric and to be responsive to community needs. So the Cocleo, I know I said that like 5 different times in this lecture, article on page 159 discusses compromising on the organizational materials in a way that meets the needs of the community members and the desires of the community members. So the author talks about how traditionally archives want to organize records in one way, but the community members wanted to organize them in a different way. And so the author was like, okay, well, we made this compromise, and we did so because we want to meet the needs and wishes of our community, even if it's not the most professional way for archival records to be organized. So that's just one example of how sort of straying away from professionalism may result in making community members happy and making your community archive more sustainable in the long run. Another interesting consideration or issue that community archives might take when making sustainability choices or thinking about sustainability is what type of materials they are collecting in the first place. The Baker article on page 477 talks about how often what ends up in community archives, especially do-it-yourself community archives, are things that we're going to end up in the trash. And while this stuff might be appealing to a particular community, it may not be something that is relevant to the broader public. So when archives are thinking about sustainability, they may tie that into what kind of materials are we accepting, or what is our donation policy? What will we bring into the archive and devote resources to preserving into the future? So, fundamentally, appraisal decisions are made so that archives spend resources on materials that are important and are worthy of continued preservation, and so the archives are not wasting resources on materials that aren't really that useful or aren't that important for the community or for the public. So just appraisal and having some kind of donation policy is an important sustainability choice that a community archive should think about. Another interesting sustainability choice that archives might think about is what their platform for access is. So the Baker article talks about Facebook and how Facebook might be accessible, but it's not a great resource for preserving community records. So, Facebook may be free, and that might be great for sustainability purposes, but it may be difficult to preserve those records long term, which isn't good for sustainability efforts and for the long-term survival of the records. And as the Cocleo article talks about on page 160, Facebook might also present some privacy concerns for community members. So you might have this tool that you see and think, wow, Facebook is free. We can put our records on here, and that will really be great for access and even perhaps preservation, but that might not necessarily be the case. So it might be worth it to invest money in some kind of platform that doesn't have the types of limitations that social media platforms may have. We talked about volunteers and how getting volunteers for community archives can be great, but there can also be some drawbacks to having what seems like a free resource. So it may be that volunteers are not familiar with the materials in a community archive, and they may not possess the knowledge required to sustain the community archive into the long run. So, that's something that you should think about when you are a community archive that is interested in having volunteer work. Again, you might think, wow, volunteers, they're free, great, let's use them. But there may actually be drawbacks that can undermine the sustainability of your archives long term. So again, just another consideration to make when making sustainability choices, and having an awareness that what seems like a great resource or a great idea at first glance might actually have some really significant limitations that can actually be harmful to your community archive and undermine its capability to survive into the future. Okay, so we'll call it a day there. I know that sustainability is something that we have talked about really for this entire course, but it's helpful to have more of a discussion about the different types of sustainability issues that impact community archives, to have a discussion about the ways in which community archives can overcome some of those sustainability issues, and also have a discussion about how some of the solutions to sustainability problems might not be as beneficial in the long run as they might appear to be at first glance. Again, every archive faces sustainability issues, but because of the unique circumstances of community archives, some of the balances that they need to make between professionalism and meeting the needs of the community, between wanting to be sustainable, but also wanting to be independent. It's especially important to place community archives within the greater context of sustainability and talk about how community archives can overcome the obstacles that we talked about in this lecture and continue to provide access to very unique, very meaningful, and very empowering, informative records into the future. So thank you for listening. Have a great week. And as always, please let me know if you have any questions.